Hello everyone and welcome to the ninth episode of the Reti Nimzo Larsen Speedrun series. In this episode, we're going to be playing 3 different games against players rated in the rating range of 1400 to 1500 in chess.com's rapid rating pool. And through the 3 different games that we take a look at in this video, we're going to be focusing on ways of playing well with our opening, of course. Specifically, I think the most instructive game is probably going to be the one where we see a sequence of moves where my opponent creates some threats. I have to kind of react to the threats that they're doing. But rather than reacting in a defensive manner, we're going to see lots of situations where I'm able to counterattack my opponent after threats that they're trying to make, reacting with my own kind of stronger forcing moves, in between moves, intermezzos, kind of equal or stronger threats, danger levels, lots of different stuff like this that we talk a bit more about during that particular game. These are definitely concepts that are very important for players to improve at as they continue improving their skills at chess. Being able to kind of dictate or control the pace of the game rather than reacting to what the opponent's trying to do themselves is going to be a very big part of playing well dynamically and continuing to become a stronger player. So that's going to be the second game in this video that I think you should definitely focus on. Other than that, the first and third games, we're also going to be playing the opening repertoire well, playing against opponents, getting good advantages from the opening, and ultimately getting the wins. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the games. All right, let's get into our first game here. We're playing against Young KIW, rated 1400 from Indonesia. So after knight f3, they go knight c6. They want to play the move e5. We've seen this move in the speedrun series so far, so in response, we do play the move d4. We do deviate a bit from our normal b3 and bishop to b2 setup, and mainly we're just trying to prevent the opponent from putting a pawn on the e5 square. As mentioned in the past, if we go for b3, black would be able to play e5 and then e4 and gain a bigger space advantage, and we really don't want to allow that to happen too easily. So we go d4, we prevent them from playing e5. Their best move here probably is just to go ahead and play d5, which is what they're going for. And after the move d5, we are going to respond in this position with the move pawn to c4, pretty much turning the position into what's known as a Chigorin defense. Black's most popular move is... Okay, they play e5. This is kind of interesting. What do we want to do against e5 here? So it's interesting here that if we take the pawn on e5, and I think if black plays d4, they'll have essentially turned the game into a... what would this be called? I think it's like the Albin counter gambit, I think is the name of that opening. This is an opening that's a bit more commonly reached by playing d4, d5, c4, e5 right away. We take the pawn, they play d4, knight f3, then knight c6. That would be essentially what would happen if we took the pawn on e5 and they played pawn to d4 here. It is an opening that's pretty good for white, generally speaking. I wonder if that is the best way of responding here. I would imagine that it's not, because we also have alternative options that are available. We can even take on e5 with the knight right away, which I'm kind of leaning towards this being the best move. And taking on d5 is also possible as well. So if we take on d5 and the queen takes back, we do have the move knight to c3 available, but maybe black can play bishop to b4 to pin the knight. And maybe black is okay there. I suppose you can still take the pawn on e5 afterwards and probably be up a pawn, but I'm not crazy about them trading with our queen on d1 and us having to take back with the king. That's not my preferred option. I think we're going to take with the knight on e5. This is kind of the one I'm leaning towards. So the difference is if black makes the exchange of knights, they could still play d4. I guess that is still a potential option. I'm not sure if that's what they would go for, but I think the extra pair of knights coming off the board once we're up a pawn is generally a good thing for us. And alternatively, if black trades the knights and then takes on c4, we could trade queens on d8 and force them to recapture with their king. That way they can't castle. But it would also be possible for us to play queen a4 check, which would hit the king as well as the c4 pawn. And in a situation like that, we would take the pawn on c4 afterwards. We'd be up a pawn and we'd be in pretty good shape. So I'm not really sure what black will do here. But I do think we're in pretty good shape with an extra pawn against all of their options. So They decided to take on c4. This was a move I hadn't really anticipated, but it does have some logic behind it. If we recapture on c4 right away, they're going to take the pawn on d4, and then they're going to be equal on material. So I don't necessarily want to do that right away. They are threatening to take the pawn on d4 anyways. So I'm leaning towards taking the knight, causing them to have these tripled c-pawns, and then probably playing pawn to e3 and just trying to capture the pawn on c4 with the bishop. That's kind of what I'm leaning towards here. I like the idea that I'm messing up black's pawn structure pretty heavily. Even if I'm not going to immediately be up a pawn, they're going to be stuck protecting this pawn on c4, and I think we have pretty good chances to win that pawn at some point, and then we will be up a pawn with a better pawn structure. A better pawn structure. So that's what I'm leaning towards here. I think that's what I'll go for. Let's make the capture. They take back. It is also possible to play queen a4 here, attacking both the c6 and c4 pawns. That actually looks pretty strong, I will say. I don't think black has a great way of protecting both. They could try to play queen to d5, but then we can play knight c3 to attack the queen. So actually, now the more I'm looking at it, I like queen a4 here. e3, I think, is also a very good and solid move too, trying to take the pawn back with the bishop, but maybe in that case, black plays bishop e6 and tries to defend things as best as they can. Maybe even bishop a6 is also available, but I think I'm going to go for the queen a4 move. If they do take the pawn on d4, then we can take on c6 with check, and then we can take the rook in the corner afterwards, which looks very good. So they do play queen to d5. This does guard both pawns. The problem, though, is that now I can play this move knight to c3, attack the queen. The queen is not able to... I guess it could move to e6. That does technically guard both, but we're gaining a little bit of time by attacking the queen. We're developing a new piece, which is generally going to be pretty good for us. And I think black is going to continue having a tough time keeping everything defended. So they do play queen to e6. This does defend pawns both at the same time. However, it is entirely possible now for us to play e3 or e4 and try to take the pawn on c4. I don't really see a good way for them to guard it a second time. Another option is to play pawn to d5, attacking the queen, taking advantage of the pawn on c6 being pinned, and then also attacking the pawn on c4 once the queen is kind of blocked off. So I think that could also be quite good as well. So d5, e3, and e4, these are kind of the three main moves I would think about. I think I'm going to go for the e4 move. I think it's better to just have a little bit of extra space in the center of the board rather than playing e3. e3 blocks in the bishop, which doesn't feel that great. So I think I'm going to go e4. And the idea is to take the pawn with the bishop, attack the queen, and then I can castle the king afterwards, and then I'll just be up a pawn with a big lead in development, a big space advantage, and a much better position. So this is my game plan, and there's really nothing black can do to guard the c4 pawn as far as I can tell. So they play bishop d7. This does protect the c6 pawn. However, it does allow me to take on c4 with the bishop. And I am wondering here, if I take with the bishop, the queen moves over to hit the pawn. If we castle, there is this move bishop h3, which is kind of annoying. It's a little bit hard to guard the pawn without pushing and losing the rook. It is also entirely possible to take with the queen here and just try to play an endgame, or try to play a middle game and trade queens where I'm just up a pawn with a better pawn structure. That also looks quite good. The pawn on c4 is still kind of undefendable, you could say. So I don't necessarily have to rush to take it, but if I take here, queen moves. It might even be a position where I really don't need to react to the threat on the pawn. Maybe I can just develop my bishop, castle queenside, and just have this gigantic lead in development. I think that's what I like the look of the most. I don't even know if I'm saying that correctly. What I like the look of the most? I like the look of that the most. I guess I am saying it correctly. Anyway, so we're up a pawn. Even if black is able to win the g2 pawn one day, in the meantime, we're probably just going to develop castle and have just, again, this gigantic lead in development that we're going to take advantage of with all of our pieces being useful in the position there. Now, if they don't play queen to g6, I probably will just castle kingside. Like, if they move the queen to e7 or something, I'll probably just castle kingside and be up a pawn, big lead in development once again, big center. Things are looking pretty good. So they go to f6. This is a little bit different. This does at least attack the pawn on d4. And so if I castle... Now, I will note here, it is important to recognize, if they take the pawn on d4, I actually have kind of a built-in tactic here, a built-in defense, you could say. If they take the pawn on d4, if I'm able to get my bishop out of the way, then I would have a discovered attack on their queen. I could actually play bishop takes f7 check, which would hit the king, as well as attacking the queen on d4 at the same time. And I would win the queen because they have to deal with the check. So I'm actually not going to defend the pawn. I'm going to go ahead and castle. Set, you could call it a little bit of a trap here. Okay, they don't take it yet. But if they had taken the pawn, then I was going to play bishop takes f7 check. Okay, the move a5, I'm not entirely sure what a5 is about. I could go e5. This is another move that looks pretty good to attack black in this position. Bishop to e3, developing a new piece, looks pretty good as well. I think I'm just going to develop a new piece. Yeah, let's just go bishop e3, we guard the pawn. They go bishop to b4, okay. I'm not really bothered by them taking this, because I can just recapture. I will also point out, if they ever play the move pawn to c5, opening up the attack on my queen, I can always block with my bishop, so I don't think I'm bothered by that either. Let's see, how do we want to approach this? I think I'll just play a3 and hit the bishop. If he wants to trade off his bishop for my knight, that's not a big problem whatsoever. I'm also ahead of the pawn still, so trading pieces is pretty good for me. And if he tries to retreat the bishop, it's going to either be in the way of the knight, or if he goes back to d6, we can play e5 and make a fork in the center. So I'm assuming he's going to take. Yeah, so he takes, I take back. I have the bishop pair, better pawn structure, up a pawn, space advantage. Everything's good for me in this position here. And all I really need to do is just continue improving my pieces and progressing forward. So I'm going to go rook to b8. Let's just get on the open file. Maybe go down to b7 to harass the pawn on c7. Might as well just go down there and hit the pawn. Don't really see a reason not to do that. They have to guard the pawn somehow. They can no longer play pawn to c5, opening up the discovered attack, because now the bishop's undefended, so I would just take the bishop there. They go queen to g6. They are attacking this pawn, but they also have this bishop h3 idea. For example, if I take the pawn and they play bishop h3, I don't really have a great way to guard the g2 pawn without having to push it and then lose my rook. So what I'm going to do is play the move pawn to f3. This guards the e4 pawn, but this also gets me ready to bring pieces back to guard the pawn on g2 if I need to. If they play bishop h3, I can play rook f2, defend the pawn, and my goal is still to start trying to capture and win the pawn on the 7th rank. If I can take on c7, then I'm just going to be up 2 pawns. And yeah, everything's pretty well defended in my position. There's not really an easy way for black to create counterplay, and we're just going to stop any little bit of counterplay that they can make. Now that bishop h3 is kind of dealt with, not a big problem anymore, and look to take the pawn on c7 afterwards. It's not super easy to guard. He has to move one of the rooks over to protect it. If he moves the a8 rook over, I might take the a5 pawn. And if he moves the f8 rook over, then both of his rooks are very passive, which is not really a great-looking situation for him to have. If he brings the f8 rook over, I might also play bishop f4 to hit the pawn again. So if he brings the queen over, then I think I can kick the queen with the pawn and then take the pawn once the queen moves away. So yeah, I think it's going to be pretty hard for black to keep this pawn on c7 alive forever. And we're just keeping everything safe and solid, and looking to progress forward using our extra material. Just not only are we okay with trading pieces, but we're also just trying to get our pieces to better squares, make improvement. You want to make sure that when you're ahead material, you don't just autopilot in the sense that, like, oh, I'm just going to focus on trading pieces. Trading is good, but you still want to work on like other improvements in the position as well. So here they guard the bishop, but they're not guarding the pawn. I think I can just take the pawn as far as I'm aware. And if they try to push the pawn, then I still have the bishop attack 2 times here. He moves the knight back to c8. Maybe some idea of knight to b6. I'm not entirely sure. This bishop is also pinned. If it moves, we might be able to take on f7, which is a good sign for us. I think knight b6 is black's idea, and so I don't really want to let them do that too easily. I think I'm just going to play rook to b1. I'm going to grab the open file, maybe double up the rooks on the 7th rank, attack the bishop, and behind the bishop once again is this pawn on f7, and I'm stopping knight to b6 at the same time. So they play knight to d6. They do attack this bishop instead. How do we want to respond here? I don't really want to let black take this, quite honestly. But it's also probably not the biggest deal in the world if they do take it. Since I am ahead material, trading's good. I think I'm going to actually go... How do I want to do this? Yeah, I'm going to go bishop f4. If they want to take my bishop, I'll take back. That's not really that big of a problem. And otherwise, I'm happy to trade pieces, I guess, is the main thing. Knight to b5 could be a little bit annoying, but probably there I even trade pieces. It's probably the idea at this point. I could have also retreated the bishop backwards somewhere, d3 or a2 or something. I didn't want to go to a2 because I thought knight to b5 was very annoying. But maybe going to d3 would have also been fine. But okay, I'm not too concerned if he wants to trade pieces. I'm up 2 pawns. Pieces are more active. I think we're in pretty good shape. The only thing I have to be a little bit careful about after this particular trade is that there could be later on down the road a kind of opposite color bishop endgame. I don't think that's likely to occur, but you know, that is something I have to factor in. So he plays knight to b5. The rook and the pawn are both hit. I do think I need to make this trade. So I'm going to make that capture. And then I'm going to retreat my queen. I think I'll go back to the... guess I'll go back to the c2 square. My rook is defended by the bishop. The bishop can always sit on g3 to keep everything safe. And slowly but surely, I'm going to try to push the pawn in the center of the board. This is my passed pawn. If I can push to d6, or d5, d6, you know, further down the board, we'll be in pretty good shape. Okay, they play b4. I think I can just capture this pawn a few times, though. I take, and then take. And yeah, so I have 3 extra pawns, and now I have a b pawn that I can also push up the board. So the game plan is just to push the b pawn, the d pawn. I also have like capturing this bishop and checking on the back rank if black isn't careful, if they move this rook on a8 away too far. Otherwise, though, yeah, I think the main plan is just to push these pawns. We have about 26 seconds, but yeah, we're up 3 pawns, and the goal is just to push at this point. A couple of things are undefended. If they try to go here, probably I'll just put the bishop on e5 and keep everything safe and solid. So I'm not entirely sure what black will do. If black puts one of the rooks on c8, like if he puts this rook on c8, I can actually take the bishop on d7, allow him to take my queen, and then capture the rook on d8 with checkmate. And if he takes on d7, I take the rook on c8. So rook to c8 actually looks like it loses piece. So we've got him thinking, which is a good sign. But yeah, again, the main goal is just to push the pawns up the board. He goes to b6. I'm going to go to c5. I'm perfectly fine with the trade of queens. If he trades, that's great. If he doesn't, that's fine too. I'll just push the b pawn if he doesn't want to trade. If he goes queen f6, I can play bishop g5 to skewer the queen to the rook there. So what will he do? If he takes with the queen, I'll probably take with the b pawn, and then I'll have 2 pawns connected together. Okay, we're going to push the pawn. That was the game plan. Let's keep everything lined up together. Now there is some threats of maybe taking the bishop and checking on the back rank, but otherwise the other threat is just to push the b pawn down the board. So let's just push, and then push, and then we can take the bishop and check. If I try to take right away and check, he can block with the rook on d8 and kind of make life a bit more difficult there. Okay, goes here. Here I have to be a bit careful. I'm going to block. I don't want to let him take on g2 with checkmate. That would be very, very bad. He's probably going to check on the back rank. I'll move the king up. Then I have to still be a little bit careful, but I also have ideas of taking the bishop and checking on the back rank as well. So he has his own king safety issues to be careful about. Okay, checks. Probably moves the queen here, threatening checkmate. But then I'll play rook to c1 and block off that, I think. My rook is protected. My pawns are all protected. Yeah, I think queen to b1 is his best move, but then I'll block with the rook and keep that safe. He's also got about 5 seconds left, so probably we're getting the win here on time. But it's already a bad position for him. He's down 3 pawns. Yeah, we do get the win on time. So he was down 3 pawns, being attacked. It's a winning position for us at the end. So let's go back and analyze the game. I think it was an interesting one. So we get into this Chigorin defense. We've seen this in some of the other games in the speedrun series. I go for c4, and he plays the move e5, which I don't think we've seen yet. I think we've seen e6 at least once. I think we've seen capture of the pawn once, I believe. And I think we've also seen a knight f6, but I don't think we've seen the move pawn to e5 yet. So against this, I think taking with the knight makes a lot of sense. If we do take with the pawn and he plays d4, this is also a good position for white, but this is known as the Albin counter gambit. I did mention during the game a different move order that you could get to this position from. Usually in this kind of setup, you want to go for moves. I think the most common way of playing is like g3, bishop g2, castle. Try to maneuver the knight around to attack the pawn, and usually white's up a pawn, which is already good, but then the pawn on d4 is still a little bit hard for black to keep defended in the long run, but black does get some active counterplay if he knows what he's doing. I decided to take with the knight instead, and then we traded the knights, we attacked all the pawns, hit the queen, gained more space, and I think here black is already just in bad shape. They really can't defend the pawn on c4, and we're going to take this pawn, be up a pawn, and have all these other advantages combined together, as we saw in the game. So we do pick up the pawn. We castled. We don't need to worry about this pawn because the move bishop takes f7 check is a nice discovered attack on the queen. We would win material here. I think it would have also been totally fine to play a move like bishop e3, though. If you wanted to guard the pawn, it still looks very, very good for white. But okay, I castled, set a little bit of a trap, then defended the pawn. I was fine with this trade of pieces. Get the rook on the open file, come down to the 7th rank to attack the pawn. And yeah, we just slowly but surely make some improvements in our position, but also try to be very aware, as usual, about what our opponent's plan or ideas might be. Here they are attacking the pawn on e4, but they also have ideas of bishop h3 attacking our pawn on g2. So for example, if I did something like, let's say, bishop to d3, this guards the pawn, but it misses this bishop h3 idea. And here I think we're in a little bit of a tough spot. The only way to avoid checkmate is to push the pawn, and then they're able to take the rook, and maybe here white is even still a bit better, quite honestly. We have the bishop pair, a better pawn structure, and more active pieces, but we are also down, a little bit of material at the same time. I'd rather avoid that. I think f3 was good, because now if they go bishop h3, I was going to move the rook up to guard the pawn. So they played rook to d8, we took the pawn for free, got the rook on the open file, hit the knight. Taking the bishop I was fine with. Kind of similar to the game, we would have a very similar kind of piece imbalance. Actually, I guess you could say we have all the same number of pieces, but we're up 2 pawns still. So that was fine with me as well. In this version of things, we're still up the 2 pawns. Black allows us to capture a 3rd pawn. We keep everything defended. And then mainly we're just working towards pushing our passed pawns down the board, pushing the b pawn. And then again, always having to watch out for the opponent's counterplay. They're not just going to roll over and die, especially as we get higher and higher up the rating ladder. They're going to try to throw counterattacks at us. They're going to try to be tricky, make threats. If you didn't think about what they were doing here and you played b7, you would just get checkmated. And otherwise, yeah, you still have to be quite careful. If you make a move like queen to c2, you're thinking, oh, I'm trying to trade queens because I'm ahead material. You would miss that black can take this pawn with a check, and then you would lose your queen on c2 afterwards, which is very bad. So rook to c2 was mandatory. And yeah, I think that black's best move was probably to play queen to b1, threaten checkmate once again. I think I would have played rook back to c1. If they want to check again, I might actually run up to the g3 square. And then finally go rook c2. They have no more checks this time. We'll trade the rooks once the queen moves. And then this is going to be game over because black has back rank issues. So he ended up losing on time at this point after I played rook c2. He checked first, and then after king f2, he lost on time here. And then we got the win. So that's it for this first game. Pretty interesting one. Let's go ahead and get into our second one now. All right, we got our next game. Let's go for our knight f3 Reti Nimzo Larsen approach. So we go knight f3, our opponent plays pawn to f6. So this is already a very weird move. We have seen different kind of versions of this pawn to f6 move in earlier games in the speedrun series. Most of the time it's after knight c6 and d5, and usually they'll try to develop, the knight and the pawn first, and then they'll play f6 intending to play the move pawn to e5 in the center. We're going to react the same way as we pretty much always do. When our opponent is trying to play the move e5, we are just going to play d4 to stop it. We prevent them from playing e5. The move pawn to f6 really just sticks out like a sore thumb. And here they go for pawn to c5, which is an interesting approach. So we almost sort of could turn this into some kind of weird Sicilian defense. If we played the move e4, they take, and we take with the knight, for example. I think that something like that is possible. What I'm going to go for here is I think I'm going to go for the move pawn to d5. I think we're just going to expand into our opponent's half of the board, expand into their territory a bit, and we just gain a bit more space. And kind of we're just making the claim that this pawn on f6 is just very misplaced. I don't really exactly know what it's going for, what it's trying to do in this situation. Taking the pawn on c5 was possible, but I think if we had made the capture just a moment ago, probably black would play e5 or queen a5 check, and they would win the pawn back. It's pretty much impossible for us to keep the pawn on c5 alive forever. And now they go for the move pawn to c4. So very weird play from our opponent. They are rated in the mid-1400s. Not what I would really expect from this rating range, so I'm just going to go for the move pawn to e4. Again, just expand in the center of the board, open up the threat of bishop capturing the pawn on the c4 square. And yeah, we just have a big space advantage. We have an extra piece developed. We're threatening the pawn on c4. Black makes another pawn move. I think we're going to go ahead and just capture the pawn on c4 for free. Not really a whole lot special about that. And they develop the bishop to the b7 square. So we're up a pawn, big space advantage, lead in development. I think I'm probably just going to go ahead and castle now at this point. I think there's other moves that are good as well, but I see nothing wrong with just getting the king safe at this point. They go queen to c7. They are attacking our bishop that's on the c4 square. I think it makes sense to just go ahead and play a move like queen to e2. Develop the queen, keep the bishop safe, and maybe one day we can try to play down the center of the board, maybe an e5 push, trying to open up the middle of the board because our opponent's king is likely not going to be castling anytime soon. They go for pawn to d6. So the biggest issue that black runs into, I'd say, aside from the fact that they already lost a pawn, but a big issue they have here is that the large majority of pawns that they have in this position are all on dark squares. What this means is that the light squares in between are kind of like a Swiss. They're like Swiss cheese holes in this kind of position. And if I could ever land, especially a knight on the e6 square, that's going to be a very, very strong piece. And I think we have a very quick way of maneuvering our knight, one of our knights to that square. We can go with knight to d4 and just try to put the knight on the e6 square. This looks very, very bad for our opponent. We could have also thrown in a check on the b5 square if we wanted to, but I think getting the knight to e6 sooner rather than later looks like a very bad situation for black here. We also even open up the idea of queen h5 check, depending on if that's a check that's worth going for. So yeah, this looks quite bad. Maybe in hindsight, if I had thought about it a little bit more, maybe the check was good to go for, because once the knight blocks, then knight to d4 to e6 is maybe even stronger. I was going to say it's probably black's best move to bring the bishop back to protect the square on e6. But now I do think I'm going to give the check on b5. The problem for black is no matter which piece they block with, I will still put the knight on e6. If they move the king, then we're also, generally speaking, we're pretty happy about that as well. So with that in mind, I don't really want to check on c6 and allow black to trade off their knight that's not doing much. At least not right away. I think I'm going to focus on developing the rest of my pieces. I also don't want to check on e6 and allow black to trade off their bishop that's doing nothing. I think I'm just going to develop the knight here. I could also maybe put the bishop on c6. And if they take, I'll take with check. And the knight looks quite strong on that square. But at the same time, I kind of want to keep this bishop alive as well. Again, I'm not in a rush to really help the opponent trade off their pieces that are on their starting squares. Like, this allows black to trade off the knight that's doing nothing. This allows black to trade off the bishop that's doing nothing. This bishop is stuck. This knight can barely move. All of black's pieces are really just stuck on the back ranks and not able to make a lot of progress. So I think in that regard, I'm going to drop the bishop back one square, mainly just to keep the control over this diagonal. If they do play b5 to harass my bishop once again, then I'll move the bishop back to b3. And then once the pawn's on b5, maybe I can play a move like pawn to a4, and maybe this can facilitate some like opening up of the position or trying to trade pawns and open things up. Even moving this knight away and then playing pawn to c4 will really blast the position open at the right time. I could even maybe consider sacrifices, but I don't think we need to go doing anything overly drastic. So black plays g6. I think I'm just going to develop the bishop. I guess going to e3 makes sense. Another option is to go for a4. Probably I should do this. I should just try to open up the position, go for a pawn trade, try to open up lines for our pieces as much as I can. They do bypass the pawn. However, I can play this move knight to a2, attacking the pawn on b4. They're probably going to play a5. That was what I assumed. And now I can go for the move pawn to c3. Again, just trying to trade pawns. I don't mind if black plays bishop a6 because I still have this check on e6 that would be available for us. Or at least that would be an idea that they'd have to be very careful about. So the bishop is still stuck protecting this. I can make the check right away. The king moves. I guess if I take their queen, they'll get mine. I get the rook in the corner. They get my rook. I don't know if I necessarily want to trade all of those pieces, but I do think I want the knight on e6 anyways. So I'm going to make the check, and then I'm probably not going to trade queens. I'll probably just move my queen away once black moves their king. If they go to d7, I could even at some point consider taking the bishop with check. So they do go to d7. So I think it's possible to actually take the bishop with check. They are going to probably move to counterattack my knight, and then I can move the knight back to safety while attacking the queen simultaneously. So I think I'm going to do that. If I take the queen right away, once again, the idea was that they get my queen, I get their rook. I guess that would have also been good too. Then they get my rook, I take back. I'm up a piece there as well. That also looked quite good. But I think I can essentially do the same idea here. Move the knight back. If they take the queen, I take theirs with check. And then I also take the rook once the king moves away. So I don't really mind that my queen is being attacked because every move I'm making is either one-upping my opponent's threat. Like a check is higher on the priority list of forcing moves compared to a capture of a queen. A check requires a response. Black cannot stay in the check or anything like that. And then as soon as they get out of the check, I come back and I equal out their threat. So a check is higher up than a threat on the queen, and then when I move the knight back to e6, I make it a threat on their queen, which equals out the same threat that they had of taking my queen. So now I'm simply up a piece. I took the bishop, got back to e6, and black has not gotten anything in return. They move the queen to safety. Here I can play the move bishop c4 to block off the diagonal. And after the trade of pieces, then we're just going to be up a piece. And also the knight will maybe even check on c7 if black's not careful. They do play pawn to b3. I will say quite honestly, I did overlook this possibility. In hindsight, maybe it would have been better to block with the pawn. I actually did completely overlook this b3 move. My knight actually is trapped on the a2 square, oddly enough, which is quite annoying, I will say. But the nice thing is that we did win a piece earlier, so even if we lose the knight, we're still going to be at least equal in material, if not ahead, because I'll take the pawn on a2 at that point. I'm going to see if I can wiggle out of this, though. I think I might have a way to wiggle out. So I'm going to make the capture on a6. If the queen takes, I will fork on c7. If the knight takes, my plan was to play queen to b5 check, making another check and another forcing move. And if the rook takes, I might still go queen to b5 check. So yeah, I think I'm going to go queen to b5 check. If they take me, I take back. And I'm continuing to make threats, trying to, once again, equal out or one-up my opponent's idea. So they pushed a pawn to attack the knight. I'm trying to answer with not defensive moves, but kind of stronger offensive moves. And this is, I think, a very, very important thing to be always on the lookout for when you are calculating and trying to figure out forcing moves and positions. Just because your opponent made a threat doesn't necessarily mean you have to automatically defend or play it a passive way in response to their threat. You can try to look for moves that beat out their threat. So earlier they attacked my queen. If I can check, that beats out a threat on the queen. Here they played pawn to b3 to attack my knight. If I can make a check or threaten their queen or make a capture that threatens something, in this case I'm going to take the queen back. I am attacking the knight. And all of my moves are coming with threats. Even though my knight on a2 is trapped, I'm actually able to kind of beat out black's ideas. They take my knight, I take theirs. Rather than having lost a piece, I am now back to being ahead one piece in this position. And now it's just going to be all about just capturing free stuff. I'll take the pawn, they take back on a6 to guard their pawn. I will develop my bishop, swing the rook over, take the pawn. Yeah, this is a very, very bad position for black. So let's just go over there. We'll take the pawn next. b4 was also a good move, taking advantage of the pin. Let's take the pawn, though. And next we're going to check on a7. Let's give that check. No matter which way the king goes, we can check once again and then take the rook in the corner of the board. So let's make that check. Take the rook, and then we're going to be up a full rook and a bishop with a gigantic lead in material. So if they go to d7, take the rook. I'm also threatening rook to d8 checkmate there. If they go to f7, I take the rook, and I'm not threatening checkmate this time. The king has an extra escape square, but it would still be a position where I'm up, loads of material and getting the win at that point. So we'll see if our opponent sticks around or if they resign. I don't know if they're gonna let the time run out or not. But yeah, I'd say in this particular game, okay, it says they abandoned the game. It's lots of people rather than resign, they just disappear and leave the game. Personally, I feel it's a bit unsportsmanlike, but okay, it is what it is. So let's go back and analyze it here. So what we're seeing here is a case where we develop with knight f3, our opponent plays f6, we go d4, and yeah, simply put, we're just preventing our opponent from playing the move pawn to e5 in the center of the board. I think if we autopilot with our b3 move, black will play e5 and d5, and I think black is actually better in this position, quite honestly, because they just got a space advantage for free and we didn't put any pawns in the center of the board. So once again, we really don't want to let our opponent play these e5 moves for free. That's why I always recommend if our opponent's about to play e5, we play d4 to stop it. Or at least if they have the potential of playing e5, we play d4 to stop it. They played c5, which was quite odd. And then c4 was also very, very bad. We played e4, we picked up the pawn on c4, and yeah, it's already just a very, very bad position for black. But it is important in these positions to still be able to effectively finish off the game and kind of shut your opponent down and win without too much trouble. So I defend the bishop. I want to put the knight on the e6 square. They kind of stopped that for now. We gave a check. Now the king cannot castle. And I think a very important thing in this position that we do is we really need to work to open up lines for our pieces so that our more active pieces and lead in development can really get into the opponent's half of the board. Because right now, even though we are up a pawn, a lot of the pawns are, still on the board. All of these things are still kind of blocking the way of our pieces. Whereas if we can kind of get rid of a number of pawns in the position, then that allows us to open up the board a bit more in a way that's a bit more favorable for us. And that's what we're trying to go for. Our pieces are all activated, but they can't really do a whole lot if there's not open lines to use them. So when you're trying to open up a position, you want to look for what's known as pawn breaks. A pawn break is a pawn move that moves up to initiate or offer a trade of pawns. The way that you identify pawn breaks is you look at where your opponent's pawns are, especially the ones that have moved off the starting square. You look at what squares they are aiming at, and that is going to be your pawn break possibilities. So everything I highlighted here is a square that one of the opponent's pawns are aiming at. So e5 would be a nice pawn break to do in the center of the board. However, they've got that square covered too many times for now. F5 is kind of hard to get to. It takes at least 2 moves to get there. G4 is 2 moves. H4 is 2 moves. Those also weaken our king a bit, which is kind of risky. C4, I talked about during the game, would be nice, but our knight's in the way. And so A4 was kind of the one that was left over. So after A4, black avoids the trade of pawns. But once we move the knight, we attack their pawn once again. And then after A5, we go for another pawn break. So it's kind of like pawn break followed by pawn break. And the goal is that, if they had taken our pawn, I would have taken back with the knight, and now we have a new open file that we can use for our pieces. We can jump the knight forward, move the bishop, swing the rook over, and I think that black would be in a lot of trouble in this position. Instead, they decided to attack our queen, which gave up the control of the e6 square. We took the bishop with check. I think taking the queen would have also worked out perfectly fine. They get ours, we get theirs, we get a rook, they get a rook. However, we get to take the bishop, and we are still ahead a piece in this position because black is not able to trap the knight. So that would have also worked. I took the bishop instead, then came back. And I think the biggest thing from this particular game that I was able to show a good job of is answering opponents' threats with your own threats rather than playing defensive moves in reaction. And this is a thing that I think a lot of very strong players, that's kind of how they separate themselves compared to more club level or intermediate level players, I would kind of say. So it's a case here where, even though black hit my queen, I wasn't thinking about moving the queen or reacting to black's threat. I was looking for my own forcing moves instead. My own check, another check, a threat on their queen. And then I do finally play a defensive move, but the damage has already been done here. And even then, when they play b3, I mentioned during the game that I completely missed this idea, quite honestly. Maybe in hindsight, pawn to c4 is a better way of doing things. It doesn't allow them to trap my knight. But even when I missed this idea that they could play pawn to b3, instead of defensively reacting, I was looking for my own forcing moves once again. So I take their bishop, I get a check, I hit their knight, I take their knight, and then I'm not even down. I'm still up my piece. I never lost the knight on a2 for free, and so I'm still ahead material and went on to win the game pretty quickly after that. And then black abandoned the game. So, yeah, I think this was a really nice game in terms of not only punishing an opponent for kind of poor opening play, but especially this idea of trying to meet our opponent's threats with our own threats or counterattacks if we can. And that's a very important part of becoming a stronger player, is not only recognizing what the opponent's trying to do and what threats they're making, but rather than automatically playing defensive moves to meet their threats, we want to really try to look for offensive counterattacking moves if possible. Generally speaking, it's better to meet offense with offense rather than offense with defense if you can help it. So, anyways, though, that's it for the second game. Let's get into our third one. All right, we've got our third game here, playing against Jalal, 1335, rated 1471. So the number and the name and the rating not matching. Rated 1471 from Iran. So after knight f3, they go d5. We are continuing with b3. They go knight f6, bishop to b2, e6. And yeah, so far our opponent's playing a very solid setup. Against this particular order of moves, I'm going to recommend going for the move pawn to c4. We do put a little bit of pressure on black center a little bit earlier in the game. And generally speaking, once they're playing pawn to c6 here, we have a couple of options in terms of where we're going to put the light square bishop. It's possible to play e3 and put the bishop on e2, but it's also possible to play g3 and put the bishop on g2. I think I'm going to lean towards putting the bishop on the g2 square here myself. Generally speaking, I do tend to like these kind of double fianchetto setups. They go for knight to e4, which is a bit odd. Yeah, I tend to like these kind of double fianchetto setups. The bishop goes to g2, the bishop's on b2. Sorry, that was a bad arrow. We're applying a lot of pressure towards the opponent's center. Dark squares, light squares, different things like that look pretty good. Now here I would normally want to play the move d3 to attack the knight that's on e4. But if we go d3, this check on b4 is actually quite annoying. We'd have to block with one of our knights. We can't block on c3 because they control that square a lot. We could bring one of the knights back to the d2 square. Then black gets to trade off this knight. It's probably fine for us. But I'm going to actually just continue developing first. I'm going to try to castle before I play the move d3 in this position. And they're going queen to b6, okay? So they are, of course, threatening, they're threatening checkmate on f2. That's definitely the biggest threat. They're even threatening pawn takes c4, which is actually a little bit tricky. So in a position like this, I actually am not sure if we can defend against both threats simultaneously, but I'm really not that bothered about losing a pawn in this position, even if it did occur, because the main issue that black is running themselves into, I would say, is that they're breaking a lot of opening principles, right? They're moving the knight 2 times in the opening. They're bringing their queen out early. They're not developing other minor pieces. They also can't really even develop the bishop off of the f8 that easily without losing the g7 pawn. So I'm actually going to go ahead and just castle the king and accelerate development. And if he wants to take the pawn on c4, I actually don't really have too big of a problem with that, quite honestly. If he doesn't take the pawn on c4, then we'll probably play pawn to d3, or some way of kind of continuing to attack black in this position. It wouldn't surprise me if this particular player went pawn bishop to c5 either. Okay, they actually retreat the knight, which is it feels very much like a wasted, they brought the knight to e4, they go back to f6, stuff like that. I think it might have been best for them to actually grab the pawn, but even if they had done this, I think I was planning on probably playing d3, and then after they open up the center of the board, we have a big lead in development. We are down a pawn, but the center of the board's open, and I think we're in pretty good shape in a position like that. But it would have still been an interesting game for sure. Instead, they retreat the knight. Now they might still want to try to take the pawn. I'm going to go ahead and play probably queen to c2, just to reinforce the pawn, but also to guard the bishop. I'm assuming black will develop their bishop. And there's not really a way for us to overly punish them for kind of the knight e4, knight f6, queen b6 moves in the opening necessarily. But at the same time, we are getting a lot of free moves in. And the general game plan in these positions, I will say, especially when our opponent's playing kind of oddly, I'm probably going to work towards playing d4 and e4 and trying to blast open the center of the board. That's kind of the gist of what I'm going to go for. So I'm going to go knight c3 first, probably d4 after, and then e4 next to really just nuke the entire center of the board, get a bigger and bigger space advantage, and look to play it that way. So they do take the pawn on c4. We're going to recapture. Everything is protected here. And then next move, assuming they don't do anything we need to react to, I'm just going to play the move e4 and grab a ton of space. That's my game plan here. I could also throw in rook to b1 if I want to eye the queen, but I really don't see a reason not to just go ahead and grab all the space in the center of the board. 3 pawns across the middle. E5 attacking this knight is maybe an idea. They do attack my queen. I'll move the queen over to e2. I will keep this d3 square under control. I didn't really want to go to b3 and then let the knight jump into d3. That was kind of what I was trying to avoid. They play a5. So this particular opponent, as we're seeing, is just, they're not making any egregious blunder type moves. They haven't like lost material or made some gigantic blunder that's going to lose them the game necessarily. But at the same time, they've let us get a big space advantage in the center. They moved the knight, 1, 2, 3 times. They've moved this knight 1, 2 times. They brought the queen out. They still haven't developed this bishop. They're pushing a pawn on the edge of the board, which I don't really know where that pawn is going. So I'm just going to prioritize now playing around the center. So we're going to make the move e5, gain more space in this position. And okay, this knight is going to have to retreat probably. Okay, it goes to the d5 square. I mean, this is just a free knight. Very surprised that 1400 rated players just kind of putting their knight on a square that's completely free for us to capture. Okay, it is what it is. I don't really know what to say. Probably here I'll just attack the knight and kick it backwards. Yeah, I suppose we might as well just kick the knight off of the b4 square. And okay, we're up a piece. I'm not doing anything crazy in these games. I'm not like doing some amazing tactic to win material in these situations. I'm really just, if the opponent's going to give me a free piece, I'm going to take it. Okay, they are putting pressure on the d4 pawn. I don't think this is actually a threat though, because even if we trade the knights, we're going to have some kind of discovered attack on the queen, which looks good. So probably here I'm just going to play a move like rook to b1 to line up with the queen. It would have also been totally fine to protect the pawn. I think that would have been totally fine to go for. But if they take the pawn, we will try to use some tactical ideas to take advantage of their queen moving around a bunch in the opening. So they do move the queen backwards instead. Now we can swing the other rook over. Probably we'll just go to the c1 square. It's also possible to play knight to b5 to attack the queen. Maybe this is even a little bit better. Yeah, let's just go for this. What I really should be trying to do is play mostly on the kingside part of the board, since that's where our space advantage is. So I'm going to move the knight off of f3, and probably we're going to just start like rushing the pawns down towards the opponent's king and trying to attack in that way. So that's going to be the game plan here. Before I do that, let's play a4 just to reinforce the knight first. That way, if they ever put the bishop on a6 to attack it, it is defended a little bit more. And next, we'll move the knight off of the f3 square and look to attack on the king side. Yeah, we'll probably just start with knight to d2, I guess. I don't know if it matters which square the knight goes to. I guess we'll do this. And I think they might want to play knight a7 to attack my knight that's pinned, but I can always move the bishop and have the rook help out guarding that, so I don't think that's a big deal. I think I'll just push the pawn. I don't really mind that this is pinned. I put the pawn on a4 in order to reinforce the knight, so that's not really going to be too much of a concern. Yeah, if they go knight a7, I guess I'll go like bishop c3 probably. I guess in hindsight, it would have also made a lot of sense to play a move like bishop a3 in the first place, just to try to trade pieces when we're up we're up a whole entire piece. So we're really just trying to we're just trying to simplify the position if we can do that as well. They went g6. I'm going to go g4. And the game plan is really just to push on the king side, open things up, and attack. That's the real thing we're going for. We're up a piece, so using that extra piece as firepower is going to be pretty useful for us. And I really don't even mind if black is able to capture this pawn a few times and win a pawn, because it's going to allow me to open up their king side pretty heavily. And right now our game plan is to maybe push the pawn to f6, kick the bishop, and then try to maneuver the queen in to deliver checkmate on g7. So that's kind of the gist of what we're looking for in this position. We could also try to swing the rook over to the h3 square, and then put the queen on h6, and that would be another way of making a very big attack or very big threat over on the king side part of the board. So, yeah, black is in big trouble here. Okay, bishop g5 is a logical move. I think we will probably just play knight f3 first to attack the bishop, though. Let's hit the bishop. If it goes back to h6, probably there we can play g5 and really just kick the bishop all the way back further and further. If he goes back this direction, we'll play f6 and then try to maneuver the queen towards the weak dark squares at that point. Plays bishop f4, okay. Bishop is kind of camping out in our territory a little bit. I think I can just go bishop c1 to trade it off, though. I can also play f6 first. Maybe we should just go f6 first. Let's do that. Then bishop c1 next move. Try to trade this bishop off. And then once this bishop is gone, then we have all the dark squares free to maneuver the queen and try to get into the h6 square. So bishop c1 is the idea. Try to trade this guy off. He takes, we take. I don't mind trading pieces anyways, but especially if I can get rid of this dark square bishop, then I can try to maneuver in on black's weak dark squares on the king side. So that's the game plan here. Okay, plays rook c2. I didn't really think about that quite honestly, but I don't think it's too big of a problem. We will just move the queen back to the d1 square. And aside from attacking the bishop on f4, I also maybe have ideas of eliminating the knight. And once the knight's gone, then the rook on c2 will be unprotected. So lots of little tricks and problems for our opponent. They do take our bishop finally. We take back with the rook. Probably they're going to move the rook over to c8 is my assumption. And I'll probably just trade pieces. I mean, again, I'm up a piece. Trading is going to be pretty good. Okay, they take me. I'll take back. And the big threat right now is queen to h6, and then getting the queen into g7. And I don't even really care that that black just took the knight on b5. I don't actually need to react to this. I can still play the move queen h6 because my threat is bigger than my opponent's. I'm kind of one-upping them in this position. I ignore the fact that they made a capture. I make a threat of checkmate. A threat of checkmate is essentially the second most dangerous threat you can make in a game of chess. A check is the strongest forcing move, but then a threat of checkmate is kind of number 2 right after that. And so here we can ignore everything black is doing, and we can just checkmate them on the g7 square. So yeah, that's the way this game went. Let's go back and analyze it. We get a pretty normal position from the opening. I think all of this so far is totally fine and normal play from our opponent. It's usually most common for black to develop the bishop, to castle, and play that type of position. I think it's very solid for them. It's a little bit on the passive side of things, especially because their bishop on c8 ends up being blocked in. But at the same time, it's a pretty solid way of playing, quite honestly. That being said, knight e4 was a bit odd, and then queen to b6 was a bit odd. And I thought that maybe black's plan was to take the pawn on c4 to take advantage of the pin. I don't want to take back right now and lose the bishop. That would clearly be bad. I think I was intending to play the move d3. I'm not sure if this is the best move, but if they take me, I take back. And okay, I'm down a pawn, but the knight's hit. My bishop is good. I can, jump forward. Maybe I can put a rook on the d file to attack on the d file one day. Maybe black is doing okay here objectively, but it feels a little bit easier to play white's moves because all of my pieces can develop pretty quickly. I can put a knight on c4, rook on d1, like something like this, for example. I don't know, they retreat, maybe hit the queen, they move back, check, like different little things like this, and black is under a lot of pressure and they're behind on development. So that was kind of my idea if they had taken the pawn on c4. Oops. Instead, though, they move the knight backwards again. So now I play queen to c2, knight c3, and then here I just look to expand and grab space in the center. d4, they trade, e4, more space, eventually e5, more space. Of course, knight to d5 is a big blunder. They should definitely not play that. The knight should go back probably to d7 or to e8. And then my plan here, I think I was going to go for... I think I might have attacked the knight first, and then I might have gone for a move like pawn to c5 maybe. Maybe even knight to e4. This also looks pretty good. We can start to kind of shuffle the pieces over towards the king side half of the board, and black is under a lot of pressure, mainly because they're so far behind on space in the center. It just makes life it makes the position a lot easier for me to play. maybe even pawn to d5 and blasting open the center looks pretty good. I mean, it's a tough position for black all around. When you're behind on space with very little counterplay, that's usually the problem that you're going to run into. Of course, though, knight d5 was a blunder. We just kind of continue improving the pieces. And like I said, we have a space advantage on the king side. We have more space in this territory. So you usually want to play on the side of the board where you have more space than your opponent, especially when you're ahead of piece. When you're ahead of piece, you have a firepower advantage. You just have more pieces that can create threats. And so we can use the extra piece to help attack the king. And that's essentially what we did later on. We played bishop c1 to trade off this defensive bishop. Once that bishop disappeared, we were able to flood the king side on the dark squares and eventually got a nice checkmate. Okay, so that's it for the 3 games in this video. Hopefully you enjoyed these 3 games as we went through them with the analysis. If you did enjoy the games, it would very much be appreciated if you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. That way you'll be able to get notified of upcoming videos that I'll be posting. Anyways, though, that'll do it for this one. Hope to see you in the next video, and I'll talk with you then.